From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Vice President Kamala Harris touches down in Wisconsin, where she's set to share a stage with former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney in a bid to bring more voters into the Democratic Party. We'll discuss the state of the race with Erin Covey at the Cook Political Report as both candidates today visit battlegrounds. Oil prices surging, meantime, as President Biden says a potential strike could target Iran's production facilities. We'll have a closer look as Israel weighs its response to Iran. Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council. Plus, bottlenecks are growing along the East Coast now as the U.S. port strike reaches its third day. The administration urging the parties to find an agreement as economists estimate billions of dollars in daily losses. Thanks for being with us here on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Vice President Kamala Harris leaving the Capitol, addressing supporters shortly in Wisconsin, just about an hour from now. She arrived earlier today in Oshkosh, meeting the state's Democratic Governor, Tony Evers, on the tarmac. The vice president now headed to Ripon, Wisconsin, considered to be the birthplace of the Republican Party. And joining us now with more on this, Bloomberg White House reporter Akayla Gardner. It's great to see you. Akayla, we'll start with this visit with Liz Cheney. Strange bedfellows, I guess, on the campaign trail. These are two people who agree on nothing with the exception of not having Donald Trump be our next president. These are unique optics on the trail today, aren't they?
Yeah, well, Liz Cheney has really become a symbol of so many members of the Republican Party who have broken from the party solely because of Donald Trump and what he represents, and particularly his actions on January 6th in 2021. And so Harris is really touting this endorsement from her today, and probably the even bigger endorsement from her father, the former Vice President Dick Cheney. And really, this is an effort to rebuild the coalition that Biden had in 2020, which included independents, which included disenchanted Republicans. She is really seeking to rebuild that, and that is going to be crucial in those blue wall states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Harris was supposed to be in Pennsylvania this week. She was not because of Hurricane Helene, and that has really disrupted this campaign schedule for both candidates, frankly.
Interesting reminder from Jason Miller, of course, one of Donald Trump's political advisors. He retweeted Liz Cheney from back in the old days when it was still called Twitter. August 11, 2020. Liz Cheney wrote, Kamala Harris is a radical liberal who would raise taxes, take away guns and health insurance, explode the size and power of the federal government. She goes on to say, we won't give her the chance. Obviously, things have changed a lot in 4 years, but it does remind us they have nothing in common politically.
Yeah, but Harris has also changed significantly. She's not the same candidate that she was in 2020. She's changed a lot of her positions, and that's in part because of her time serving as vice president and really shadowing Joe Biden, who was really seen as a centrist, someone who was really hailed for his time using bipartisanship on the Senate. So she has changed herself as well, and that also might be part of the reason why we're seeing Liz Cheney now endorse her and support her.
You were with Joe Biden yesterday in the Carolinas surveying hurricane damage. Pretty tough trip for him. He's extending that trip, of course, today to Florida and Georgia. Consoler-in-chief is what we keep hearing. What did he see? This was an aerial tour. It's not like he was on the ground with officials who are, in the process of this cleanup. What did the commander-in-chief see on this tour?
Well, I think it's notable that he's doing these now 2 days in a row. And Biden has really described this as a storm of historic proportions. He says the country hasn't seen anything like this since the 1900s. And he is really pushing now for more funding from Congress. And there's growing bipartisan support for that to happen. The question is how soon and how much. We really do not know the answer to either of those. Congress right now is on recess, and people are really pushing for them to come back to Washington to hopefully pass something as soon as possible. And Biden really urged that today. He says this needs to happen sooner rather than later.
It's noteworthy that we're talking about two major swing states that were impacted here in terms of the Carolinas and Georgia. Donald Trump today on Truth Social, Akayla, heading to Michigan, he writes, we'll be going to North Carolina next week. Date to be determined because I don't want to do anything that's going to interrupt their rescue efforts. I guess implying that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are doing the same. But wasn't he in the storm zone earlier this week?
Yeah, he was there in Georgia. He's really tried to make this hurricane a political issue. He's criticized the administration's response. He also seemed to imply that Governor Brian Kemp had not been in touch with Joe Biden. That turned out to not be the case. And really, most of the governors and officials on the ground have really been thankful for the quick response of the presidency. So there's no evidence quite yet that the federal response is lacking. Well,
we'll keep tracking them on their tour here of the storm zone. Akayla, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Akayla Gardner covering the White House for us here on Bloomberg. We know President Biden was also briefed today on the widening war in the Middle East. As he departed for Florida, the president told reporters that the U.S. is discussing possible Israeli strikes on Iranian oil facilities. Listen.
Do you support Israel striking Iran's oil facilities, sir?
We're in discussion of that.
After those comments, the price of oil jumping 5% on the news. For more, we're joined now by Nick Wadhams, who leads Bloomberg's national security coverage here in Washington. Nick, it's great to have you. Did he mean to say that? Did he plan to say that, I guess, when he walked out of the White House today?
I don't think he planned to say it. I mean, what it says to me is that we are in a moment of such ferment and such touchiness where the president can essentially make, I mean, you can interpret that, viewers can interpret that however they want when they see a clip like that, but it feels very much like an offhand comment. I think what the president said, always a fool's game to try to get inside the head of the leader of the free world. But I think what he's indicating is essentially that the U.S. is in conversation with Israel about what happens now after that attack on Tuesday. And there are a lot of options on the table. He has said very clearly he would not support a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. He did have some additional comments after he made that remark, suggesting that he's also a little bit wary. I mean, a strike on the energy infrastructure in Iran would send energy markets completely haywire. I mean, and he clearly realizes that. So, but to me, when I see that, really just show, I mean, we are on a knife's edge in the region. There's a lot of concern. Iran launched this attack. Israel is expected to respond in the coming days, and the U.S. is really trying to shape that to deter Iran, but to avoid even further escalation. So that's the challenge here.
Wow, incredible. Israel did strike Lebanon overnight, striking Beirut. We're clearly seeing some kind of back and forth continue here with Hezbollah. We heard earlier today from the State Department spokesman Matthew Miller about the prospect of Israel now fighting on two fronts.
Additional escalation in the north was potentially destabilizing on the West Bank, and they would ultimately find themselves in a number of different confrontations. So that continues to be our assessment, that the longer conflict goes on, the risk you have of additional conflicts breaking out, and that is, puts the Israeli security services in an extremely stretched situation.
Nick, I mentioned this as well because Israeli forces stepped up attacks in the Gaza Strip overnight as well. So this is, in fact, a two-front war.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is doing exactly, frankly, what it said it was going to do and what the U.S. and many of its allies have really cautioned it against doing. So, I mean, what you're seeing here essentially is an Israeli government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu that is more or less completely disregarding the United States at this point. I mean, the U.S. has sought to exert some leverage to shape this. They were joined a call by the Group of Seven today calling for a de-escalation. They called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, called for an end of the hostilities in Lebanon as soon as possible. But really, you're seeing Israel saying, listen, these are our goals, and we're not going to stop fighting until we've achieved those goals, and that's the destruction of Hamas and Hezbollah. Whether they can achieve that, obviously, is another thing, and that's really what the U.S. is concerned about. What's the end point here? What's the strategy for the day after the guns fall silent? Yes. And that's the conversation they are not able to have with Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he says, no, we're going to keep going.
Is delay part of the strategy as Israel calculates its response to Iran? Let them sweat?
I mean, certainly they want to exert as much influence and, yes, keep Iran off balance as much as they possibly can. Yeah. But, I mean, you can be very sure the Israeli government, numerous officials said in no uncertain terms they will respond. And so I think what you're seeing now is trying to figure out how to strike that balance between, you know, listen, Iran just fired 200 ballistic missiles at us. We feel compelled to send a message in response and neutralize some of that threat. But, you know, Israel also does not want a massive war that pulls in the United States, that pulls in Iran and creates an even more difficult and violent situation than it already has. I mean, they've got war on two fronts. they want war on a third front. I mean, this is all what the prime minister is thinking about right now.
Well, you wonder if this is a military response or maybe a cyber response at some point, or a combination thereof. And I know that that's something that you're looking into as well. Nick Wadhams reporting for our national security team here in Washington. Nick, thank you so much. Coming up, new analysis just out from the Cook Political Report as we turn our attention back to the campaign trail. Erin Covey will be with us next. The latest on how each candidate is resonating in the key battlegrounds that could decide this election. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
People who were critically and adversely affected by the storm are probably not thinking about turning out to vote. They're worried about other things. They're trying to find their loved ones. They're trying to rebuild their lives. The local elections officials in these areas are going to try to do their level best to make sure that people have access to voting facilities, that they have access to absentee ballots. But we do understand if people are focused on other things.
It was Andra Gillespie, political science professor at Emory University, on the early edition of Balance of Power today, talking about the impact, hard to quantify right now, of the hurricane on the election and voters specifically in the state of Georgia, where she is. Joining us right now is Erin Covey, editor at the Cook Political Report. Erin, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. You've got new research that I want to ask you about that brings us right down the middle in this presidential campaign. But I just wonder, knowing it's difficult to quantify, how concerned that these campaigns should be about an interruption in turnout because of the aftermath, the damage left by Hurricane Helene. The idea of early voting already being underway in North Carolina makes us wonder what this could look like if people simply can't get to their ballots. Erin, how big of an interruption could this bring?
I think it's really hard to tell at this point. You know, if this had happened a couple of weeks later, then we would have been in a much more complicated situation. But I think a majority of folks in these states probably weren't going to be casting their ballots until we get closer to Election Day. You know, hopefully the infrastructure is in a better place at that point. I'm sure voters have other things on their minds right now. But this storm, it impacted areas across Georgia, North Carolina that are both red and blue. So this is definitely an offset to both campaigns. But, you know, I think that hopefully it won't have too much of an impact on turnout in these parts of the country.
Well, the response to this storm then could really speak to the power of incumbency if we consider the idea of people not voting early. They're waiting until November. And the way the administration handles this could be a real factor in how they vote.
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, I mean, our latest round of swing state polling shows an incredibly close race in both Georgia and North Carolina. Trump and Harris were tied at 49% in North Carolina, and Trump had a narrow 2-point lead in Georgia. So it's really coming down to the wire in both states. And any event like a natural disaster could impact the way voters make their decisions and could have an eventual impact in a race where the margins are going to be so narrow.
Well, I'm glad you pointed us there. That's why you're joining us, Erin, to talk about this new research. These are, of course, the same swing states that we're talking about every day around here. And indeed, when it comes to Georgia, where President Biden is today, Kamala Harris was yesterday. When I see the word tied on your research, it says a lot to us. 47 to 48, when including third-party candidates. It's 47-49 when we're not. This is all within the margin. North Carolina tied 49-49. It really makes us realize how close this race is. There had been a bit of a post-convention bounce for Kamala Harris. Is it gone?
You know, I don't know if it's necessarily that there was a post-convention bounce for her. I think it was more that there was increased enthusiasm once she announced her candidacy, and that kind of rode through the convention a bit. It settled down a little bit. We're not in the honeymoon period anymore, but it's still clear that this is a close race. You know, our polling back in August also showed an incredibly close race, and there has been very little movement since then. Currently, Harris has a narrow lead in 5 of the 7 swing states, but that's that's all within the margin of error. Trump has a narrow lead in Georgia, and they're tied in North Carolina. So it's really difficult to make any sweeping judgments about these results if we're just looking at the top line head-to-head numbers at the top of the ticket. But what we have seen in our polling is there has been a bit of a shift in voters' views about the economy, which is interesting because the economy, as we know, is probably going to be the driving issue in this election in voters' minds.
Well, it's interesting. I'd like to hear what you are finding, because in a lot of other polls, we're seeing Kamala Harris close the gap with Donald Trump. But as soon as we say that, Erin, there's a dock workers strike that is now in its third day. We're going to have a report on this coming up from our reporter, Tyler Kendall. If this thing stretches on, the economic impact could be great. We could be talking again about supply chain shocks. We could be talking about rising prices all over again. The timing here with the election in November could be very destructive for the Harris campaign, no?
Potentially, yes. And it comes at a bad time because just now we're getting to a point where it's clear that voters are worried less about inflation than they were back in May. Even in August, we have seen a shift in the amount of voters who are concerned about inflation. But at the same time, we've also seen that Harris has been able to close the gap in terms of who voters trust most on the economy. Trump had a lead before. Harris has tightened that lead now. And we've also seen that Trump and Trump's campaign have struggled to necessarily tie Harris to her and the Biden administration's current economic policies. And there has definitely been a separation in the way voters view her and Biden.
Well, you consider what we have talked about so far this hour, the situation in the Middle East, the dock workers strike we just mentioned, the recovery from a natural disaster. All of these could change the course of such a close campaign, all on their own in the coming weeks, depending on how they resolve. But of course, Erin, sometimes problems are forced errors in a campaign. And there's a new report in the New York Times about Congressman Mike Lawler, the Republican from New York, pictured wearing blackface as a high school senior around October of 2006. He's at a party dressed as Michael Jackson. Now, he has described this in his reaction as something that should be considered a great compliment to a musical hero of his. How's it going to play in the campaign?
Yeah, it's been a bad month for New York politicians. He's not the only one who has had to deal with a late-breaking scandal. One of the other vulnerable Republicans in New York, Anthony D'Esposito, is also dealing with a lot of negative headlines surrounding an affair. But, for both Lawler and D'Esposito, these are both Republican members of Congress who are sitting in toss-up races. They're both running for re-election in districts that Harris is likely to win at the top of the ticket. So they're already in tough positions, and any sort of error could mean the difference for them. And so, for Lawler, this is also, I think, coming at a bad time. We'd seen earlier in the cycle that he had a pretty decent lead over his Democratic opponent, Mondaire Jones, and he had a pretty strong brand in this district for a freshman as well. But we've seen that shrink over the past month. And now with this news coming out, I think we can only expect that that will remain close.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, we remember what happened to Governor Ralph Northam in Virginia. That took place in the 80s when his photograph was taken. This was in 2006, Erin. I'll be curious to see how this goes over in the next 24 to 48 hours. Erin Covey, great to have you back. She's editor at the Cook Political Report. Thanks for bringing that new polling data to us here on Balance of Power, Erin. Coming up, cargo ships pile up. As we've been discussing, the U.S. port strike hitting day 3, the White House weighing in now as the dispute threatens to hit Americans' pocketbooks just ahead of the election. The latest reaction from both sides of the aisle next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. There's a bottleneck of container ships forming outside some of the nation's largest ports as dock workers strike along the east and Gulf coasts. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has the latest now on the political implications. Tyler, we're now hearing from the White House.
Yeah, hey, Joe. As the U.S. port strike reaches its third day, President Biden told reporters he thinks there's been progress with negotiations. The president indicates he has no plans to intervene, despite some calls for the White House to take action at a further economic disruption.
I think we're making progress on that.
So how much progress? Any updates?
We'll find out soon.
The White House says it won't invoke a federal law that could limit labor powers and force striking workers back on the job, known as Taft-Hartley. President Biden and Democrats are balancing union support with what could be growing implications for American consumers ahead of the election. If there's a prolonged strike, Bloomberg estimates container shipping rates could re-spike. Higher rates could lead to higher prices as companies find alternate routes that can be longer and more expensive. Our analysts see that even if the strike ends in the coming days, it could take weeks to clear that backlog. A J.P. Morgan analysis out this week estimates the strike could cost the U.S. economy $3.8 billion to $4.5 billion per day. Now, Vice President Kamala Harris says she's on the side of the dock workers and enjoys strong union endorsements. But Bloomberg Television had the chance to catch up with Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik earlier this week at the vice presidential debate, and she says the party's looking to change that.
This trend where workers feel left behind in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's economy. You're seeing significant shifts among union voters increasingly voting for Republican. That's very different from union leadership that has been, side by side with political leaders on the left.
Now, for his part, President Trump has backed the union in this case, saying American workers should be able to negotiate for better wages against the foreign-owned shipping companies. They've seen some record profits in recent years, and it's one of the sticking points in the negotiations. The party is divided, though. Some House Republicans today sent President Biden a letter urging him to intervene. Joe, they pointed to the growing number of stalled ships off the coast. You can see them on your screen now, saying 56% of containerized imports pass through these impacted areas.
Map go on your terminal. Tyler, I never thought I'd be asking you about this, but there are reports today from some analysts that there's a new run on toilet paper because people think it's going to interrupt the supply. This is bringing back some weird COVID memories. This has nothing to do with the strike, though, right?
Right, Joe. So we've actually learned today that most of toilet paper production is domestic. It's in the U.S., so it's not necessarily something that American consumers need to worry about when it does come to these strikes. Instead, I'd point you to some concerns related to perishable goods. Those, of course, are a top concern as they try to unload and get these ships to their docks. Another thing that analysts are watching are car parts, which rely so heavily on this ocean freight to come to the U.S. But clearly, even without some of these more domestic impacts, as economists tell us that we will wait to have to see them, it's clear that it's top of mind for consumers and that President Biden's going to need to thread that needle with the economy.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, thank you so much for the report. Go easy on the toilet paper. We don't need to relive that whole thing. We'll have a lot more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Israel at this point has launched what they have described, and we're going to watch and see, but what they have described as limited incursions across the border to try and push Hezbollah back so 1701 can ultimately be implemented. We're going to see how that unfolds over the coming days.
It's Matthew Miller, spokesperson for the State Department, talking earlier today. With us now, Carmiel Arbit, with our eyes turning to the Middle East. She's senior fellow of Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. And Carmiel, it's great to have you back. I want to start with you on what's happening in Lebanon. Everyone is waiting to see what Israel's response will be to Iran. But indeed, as Israel and the State Department echoing their terms this as limited incursions, we saw Israeli airstrikes overnight in Beirut, killed at least 9 people and injured 14 others. Should we be paying more attention to what's happening right now across the northern border?
Yeah, so Israel is now engaged in a multi-front war between Hamas and Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, the northern front with Lebanon, conflict with Iran, Yemen. And so it's hard to know where to turn your gaze at any given moment. I think the expectations for Israel and what the Israeli government has really laid out vis-a-vis Lebanon is still going to be relatively limited, meaning there's no intention to reoccupy Lebanon in any meaningful way. Rather, the intention is really to create a buffer zone in the south so that Israelis feel safe in the north of Israel. Israel's goal is essentially threefold: to allow the nearly 100,000 displaced people in the north to return to their homes, to deplete Hezbollah's arsenal and to weaken the group and to push it back. And I think we will continue to see Israel pursue those objectives in Lebanon. The question now is how they deal separately with Iran.
Well, I want to ask you then about the planning for a response to Iran, because, of course, all of this overlaps. Joe Biden got a lot of people worked up today in the oil market when he took a question from a reporter outside the White House asking if they were considering strikes against Iran's oil infrastructure. He said it's being discussed. Sent crude oil up about 5%, Carmiel. And during his rally today in Michigan, Donald Trump weighed in on this as well, about what President Biden said about attacking oil installations. Let's listen.
He said, well, they'll have to do, I don't want them to do anything, Israel, but as long as they don't destroy the nuclear weapons on the other side. I said, did he say that? Isn't it supposed to be the opposite? No, as long as you do destroy the nuclear weapons.
Recalling a day earlier, Carmiel, when Joe Biden said absolutely no when he was asked about targeting Iran's nuclear program. Are we then to believe that oil is on the table, or should he not have said that?
Yeah, I think that what Biden has also made clear is that the U.S. administration is going to advise the Israelis on what to do, but ultimately does not control what the Israeli government is going to do in its retaliation. There are a number of options that they are considering. There's a huge amount of domestic pressure in Israel to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. This, of course, is the key existential threat that Israel views to its survival. They have significant amounts of intelligence and surveillance on those nuclear programs, and it is a real and serious target for them. That, of course, is very concerning for the international community, could have massive reverberations. And so the U.S. is pushing Israel to consider kind of lesser steps in terms of how they can respond. So that could include, as you said, attacks on the oil markets. It could include targeted killings of leadership. We could see some types of airstrikes. It has a lot of options at its disposal, none of which the U.S. would view as optimal. But at the same time, the U.S. has made clear they're going to stand by Israel. They had, of course, been pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, have been working to de-escalate this conflict, but also understand that they're going to be with their ally no matter what they do.
Stuxnet was almost 20 years ago, Carmiel. I couldn't believe it when I realized that today. But I wonder if this idea of conducting a cyber attack, for instance, which Iran would surely deny ever impacted anything, might be the more effective route. I wonder if that, in fact, is on the table as well, a cyber attack against centrifuges or some element of Iran's nuclear program.
I think that nothing is off the table at this point, and I would expect to continue to see cyber warfare between these countries. At the same time, I do think Israel is eager to reestablish deterrence. The ballistic missile strike was significant. And while we're still hearing information about exactly what targets were struck, exactly what was hit, this was not small. This was not a minor response from the Iranians, and I would expect at least a proportionate response from the Iranians. Or excuse me, from the Israelis to the Iranians. I think the other question here for the Americans is going to be whether or not they're involved or taking a step back and letting these things happen.
Is it possible to respond in a way that ends the tit for tat, or is this our new reality?
I think that we are going to be looking at this as the new reality for a long time. I think the question is simply going to be, how often is the tit for tat going to happen? And is it just going to be tit for tat, or is this going to escalate only further? And I think the hope of the international community at this point is to avert a World War III rather than this sort of smaller scale war of attrition.
Yeah. To what extent, Carmiel, does the answer hinge on the election here in the U.S.? Much has been said about Joe Biden's deteriorating relationship, if there's anything left between him and Benjamin Netanyahu.
I think the personal relationship between Netanyahu and Biden may be degrading over time, as is the case with really everyone who has to deal with Bibi Netanyahu. But at the same time, the relationship between the countries and the administrations remains very strong. And we see that, again, in the context of this Iranian strike. While on the one hand, the U.S. had been calling for Israel to really kind of step back from the brink, at the same time, when it comes to the battlefield, they are there to defend them. The U.S. is going to give Israel the space that it needs. Now, that doesn't mean that Netanyahu doesn't have his eye on the elections in the U.S. and will be looking for how he can get the best possible deal and the most support that he thinks he can get as he moves forward in the region.
Carmiel, how important is the Jewish calendar right now? High holidays and what might come next?
Yeah, the Jewish calendar is, of course, very important. I think that many Israelis went into the new year, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, with the hope of leaving behind them the tragedies of the year past, and instead find themselves on the precipice of yet another larger scale war, another conflict on a new front. And I think that that is really trying for Israel and the Israeli people. I do think that we're going to see quiet because of the holidays and in between the holidays, but I would not expect to see quiet throughout the holiday season, which is to say the Jewish holidays are going to be taking place throughout October. And I would expect that the moments they pause, we will see greater action on the part of the Israelis.
Remembering as well the significance of Monday, it will be October 7th. And 1 year since this all began. Carmiel, it's great to have you back. Carmiel Arbit, Senior Fellow of Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. We thank you, as always, for the insights. Coming up, our political panel weighs in on these issues, the conflicts in the Middle East, and a lot more. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Israel is now engaged in a multi-front war between Hamas and Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, the northern front with Lebanon, conflict with Iran, Yemen. And so it's hard to know where to turn your gaze at any given moment.
Carmiel Arbit of the Atlantic Council, just moments ago here on Balance of Power, speaking to the growing conflicts in the Middle East. With us now, our political panel, Ashley Davis, Republican strategist and partner at West Front Strategies, alongside Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist and partner at Rock Solutions. Great to have you both here. As we start with our eyes on the region, Ashley, I wonder your thoughts on this right now. It's one of three major stories that are really out of the control of the campaigns at this moment. We can start with the administration when it comes to the way this is being handled. Joe Biden upset the oil market today. But to what extent is Kamala Harris tied to Joe Biden?
I think that she's going to have to be tied to the issue more and more if this continues and the strikes continue, and especially with the oil prices. I don't think it maybe matters nationwide, but it does matter in places like Michigan, where there is a huge Palestinian presence, but also the race is so close there. So I don't think it matters in every state, but I do think that there's certain states that it's definitely, she's going to have to. I mean, she has come out and made statements, but the worse this gets, and the other two issues that you talked about, the ports and the hurricane, I hate to call it the October surprise, because it's not, but Karl Rove called it today in the Wall Street Journal. It's like the October butterfly wings, it's, that everything affects everything else. And it is kind of a bunch of ripples. So.
Well, it's interesting. The idea of this non-committed or uncommitted vote that Joe Biden was facing during the primary cycle, does that transfer to Kamala Harris if progressives don't see sunlight between these two?
I mean, I really think that the party is united. I do agree that there is going to be an effect, and the campaign is surely looking at states like Michigan. But the progressive, the base, there is such a need and a desire to elect Kamala Harris rather than Donald Trump, that so much of what he has done, I mean, I think support for her will overcome a lot of what would be, if we were running against a quote-unquote normal Republican candidate. Those normal things might be true, but in this case, I think that she will fare much better.
I was just going to say the key is to unite to beat him more than anything, because she has gone to the middle on a bunch of issues, and you see like AOC and others and Sanders that obviously don't love her going to the middle, but it's better than having him.
Right. I want to go back to what Joe Biden said today about Iran. It's a very brief snippet here. Is just in the driveway, walking out of the portico where reporters wait for the president on his way to the airport, to the helicopter, I should say, on the way to the airport. Again, about the idea of striking Iran's oil facilities. Listen.
Do you support Israel striking Iran's oil facilities, sir?
We're in discussion of that. I think that would be a little, anyway.
It's being discussed, upset the oil market, crude oil prices went up. It just gives you a hint of what could happen if that actually took place. Do Democrats forfeit the election in that world? Gas prices would go through the roof.
I mean, I think that would be a political consideration. But unfortunately, when you're the vice president of the United States, you're currently holding office.
Yeah.
And you're working with the president of the United States. So you have to govern. And you have to communicate with our allies. And the president is clearly indicating things to the rest of the world that are happening. I don't think that was an accident. So, you know, it can tie you down a little bit when you actually have to do your job at the same time that you're running for office.
Well, yeah, sometimes you need to do what's best for the country or what's best in the moment. Ashley, what's your thought on that?
It shows how powerful the United States presidency really is. I mean, he moved the markets today, as you said. Yeah. But what's interesting and what has happened over the last several weeks is I don't know what we're saying matters anymore. I mean, Netanyahu has decided, and he's obviously defending his country, and they were attacked by terrorists on October 7th. So he's like done. So he's doing what he wants to. I don't know how much say we have anymore. But I think that this isn't done, and I think that they're going to continue to do what they're doing.
Donald Trump talking about geopolitics today, not only criticizing Joe Biden for saying no to the idea of striking Iran's nuclear complex, but going further to say this about Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who comes up a lot in his stump speeches. Listen.
We were respected 4 years ago. We were respected. Viktor Orban, he's the head of Prime Minister of Hungary. He said the only thing wrong with the world today is Trump isn't president, because if he was president, there'd be no conflict whatsoever. You know, I had no conflict. We had no wars. We had no nothing.
Okay, so the Viktor Orban obsession is one thing. But let's get to this idea, because we hear it from Republicans a lot on this program. No new wars. Economy was strong. Say all you want about his personality, but the no new wars line should generate what response from Kamala Harris or the Democrats?
I mean, I think that there are things that happen across the world that, you know, I think that we don't have total control over. The economy, the idea that the economy is totally tanked and that we're worse off than we've ever been before, as Trump would have you believe, under a Biden administration is just wrong. You just look at the numbers. People are doing, we've had more oil production, you know, now than we ever did under the Trump administration. I mean, just you just look at the facts, right? And people, I think you say things that are not true over and over and over again, even if you're looking at how it impacts business, large and small, that if you say it enough, people tend to start perhaps believing it.
Yeah. Was the world a safer place under Donald Trump?
Right or wrong, his rhetoric, I think that people, and I heard it all the time traveling the world, like he's 1 minute away from pushing the red button, and kind of tongue-in-cheek, which isn't funny. But I do think that there was significant concern around the world that he would retaliate. And
that checks behavior.
It does check behavior. And so I actually do think that people were, I'm not saying that they respected America more, because I think in some instances they didn't because of his rhetoric. But I think in the war, I do believe, and you guys all know my politics, but I think that Ukraine and Russia will be done if he comes over. I think that there's probably a deal to be struck in some part of the land. You know, there'll be some concessions. Yeah, wow. I think there'll be concessions.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but it's like you have to have a completely unhinged president of the United States that people are worried that he's not in his right sane sanity.
Dark Brandon in this situation with Iran?
It's kind of crazy. I would rather have an even-keeled president who is, you know, using his diplomatic ties and working across, you know, the water to talk to other people than to have somebody that everybody is just like looking to Angela Merkel to be the leader of the free world. I mean, honestly, you know, talking to each other because they're so worried about what the president of the United States is going to do.
Wow. An honest conversation with our panel here. This is fascinating. Coming up, Liz Cheney enters the conversation as well and sharing a stage with Kamala Harris right now. There's the podium as we speak on Bloomberg TV. They're doing this at the birthplace of the Republican Party in Wisconsin. Ashley and Kristen continue next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio as we're moments away from Kamala Harris's political rally where she's going to be joined by none other than Liz Cheney. There you see it now on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, the birthplace of the Republican Party in Ripon, Wisconsin. Still with us, our political panel, Ashley Davis, partner at Westfront Strategies, and Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Thanks again to both of you for being here. Really, Liz Cheney? This is someone who doesn't agree with Kamala Harris on a single political issue, right? Except hating Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I mean, she has been, probably the most high-profile Republican, except for maybe her father, who said he was going to vote for Kamala Harris as well. But this just underscores, what the Democrats, what the campaign is doing, building a coalition of people from across the political spectrum. We know we have to do that in order to win. I think Trump's base will come out no matter what. We have to work for it. We have to go door to door. We have to, appeal to all kinds of different voters. So if there are some voters, independent or maybe, lean Republican, folks out there, I think it could be helpful.
A lot of us have been rereading a tweet from Liz Cheney from back when we actually called it Twitter, from 2020, August 11. And it was retweeted or re-X'd, whatever we call it now, by Jason Miller, Donald Trump's political advisor. Kamala Harris is a radical liberal who would raise taxes, take away guns and health insurance, explode the size and power of the federal government. She wants to recreate America in the image of what's happening on the streets of Portland and Seattle. Recall, this is 2020. Liz Cheney wrote, "We won't give her the chance." Ashley, who is this for, this event today?
Well, I have to say, I know Liz very well. As a friend of mine. Obviously, as you were talking about, there is not one issue in the Democrat Party that she believes in. I mean, she's really conservative.
Think of the border. Think of reproductive rights. All the stuff that Kamala Harris stands for.
Absolutely. However, she does believe in democracy. So if I were Kamala's campaign, one, they're bringing too high profile, her dad and her, in regards to over to endorse them. That was a win. But I don't think it moves the needle because she has been so demonized within our party. I just don't know if it makes much of a difference. I'm actually surprised. You have people like Mitt Romney who don't like Trump. You have others that definitely are high profile that don't like Trump. To be on one thing to endorse, another thing to be on a campaign stage. So I'm actually surprised about that.
Yeah, I think it was John Bolton on CNN today said he's no longer writing in Dick Cheney for president. He's going to write in Ronald Reagan. It makes you wonder, who are we trying to convert here?
It's so funny. It's like, these people who are writing it, I can't with this. I was like, pick a team, guys. Like, pick one.
Well, I want to ask you both.
Can I write in Nikki still?
Well, I think some people may. Talking about the uncommitted vote here.
Kidding.
We talked earlier about the mission to survey hurricane damage and console people impacted by Hurricane Helene by both President Biden and Kamala Harris, and in fact by Donald Trump earlier in the week. Andre Gillespie, the political science professor at Emory University, had this to say about the candidates taking these journeys a little bit earlier today. Listen.
Empathy matters. That reflects on the president's character, and that certainly is going to reflect on whether or not a person wants to vote for somebody to be president of the United States. And so somebody who appears to be uncaring or unfeeling is somebody who is not necessarily going to be moved by any material aid. So it's really important. And so there was no question that the presidential candidates were going to show up in the disaster zone at some point.
Is this more than a photo op for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden?
I mean, certainly. I mean, Joe Biden, the consoler in chief, I mean, he is somebody who is adept at doing this, knows when he needs to go down there, when he needs to be, this is their job, right? And they're doing their job. And so that's why you saw Kamala go down there and did not mention Trump's name, did not make a political event out of it, unlike Trump, who used it, basically as a campaign stage.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. When Donald Trump's criticizing them today, saying he won't go to North Carolina until next week to not interrupt the rescue process, he was in Georgia Monday.
Well, I did, yes, but I lived through this with Katrina, with Bush, and he was criticized for not going down for exactly that reason and flying over, which Biden did, by the way, the same exact thing. But that was like literally the beginning of the end with President Bush. just that he didn't look like he was connected. I believe that all the candidates cannot go and look at the suffering and the human suffrage that's happening in these parts of the country that is just catastrophic. So yes, they're going to turn into political. If I were I'm getting cut off in my ear, I think. I had brilliant things to say, Joe.
You already have. It just reminds us, it brings us back to where we started and the stories that the candidates cannot control. Ashley Davis and Kristen Hahn, thank you for a great panel. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. We'll see you tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.